40 million Americans believe Viking blood runs through their veins. But what if the DNA tells a different story than the one they grew up believing? Before we go further, do one thing for me. If you have ever wondered where your own blood truly comes from, stay with me until the end, because this story might change how you see your own name. Somewhere in America right now, a man is looking at a spit tube. He just sent his saliva to a lab. He is waiting. He grew up hearing stories. His grandfather used to say their family came from fierce warriors who crossed icy seas in wooden ships. Strong men, brave men, men who feared nothing, Vikings. That word carries weight. It carries pride. It carries an image of horned helmets, thunder gods, and long ships cutting through gray water. For generations, millions of families in America have held on to this idea. They believe their ancestors were Norse warriors, explorers, raiders, survivors. And it is not just a small group of people. Surveys and DNA companies suggest that around 40 million Americans believe they have a Viking ancestry somewhere in their bloodline. 40 million people. That is more than the entire population of Canada, all convinced that ancient Norse blood flows through their bodies. But here's the question that started shaking this belief. Is it true? Is it really true? Or is it something else? Something softer? Something more human, but somehow just as powerful? To understand this, we need to go back. Back before DNA tests. Back before ancestry websites. Back to a time when stories were passed by mouth, from grandfather to father, from father to son. In many American towns, especially in the Midwest, Viking pride became part of daily life. Statues of Norse warriors were built in small cities. Sports teams took Viking names. Restaurants and festivals celebrated Norse heritage. Minnesota alone became almost famous for it. Blonde hair, blue eyes, and tall, strong bodies became symbols people connected to Viking blood. It felt real. It felt personal. Because immigration records showed that many Scandinavian families really did move to America in the 1800s. Norwegians, Swedes, Danes. They came by the boatload, searching for land, freedom, and a new life. So the connection made sense on the surface. If your family came from Norway, then surely, somewhere far back, real Vikings must be sitting in your family tree. That was the story most people believed. And for a long time, nobody questioned it deeply. But then science entered the room. And science does not care about pride. It does not care about legends. It only cares about truth. When home DNA testing became popular, something interesting happened. Millions of people, curious about their roots, sent their saliva to labs. They expected clear answers. Viking, yes or no. Simple. But the results were far more complicated than anyone expected. Here is where the story starts to crack open. Scientists explain that DNA cannot directly detect the word Viking. Viking was never a single ethnic group or a bloodline. It was actually a job, a role, a way of life. The word Viking comes from an Old Norse term that basically means going on a raiding or trading journey by sea. In other words, being a Viking was something you did, not something you were born as. Think about that for a moment. A person could be Norwegian, Swedish, Danish, or even from other backgrounds, and still become a Viking simply by joining sea voyages, trade missions, or raids. It was closer to a profession than a bloodline, almost like calling someone a soldier or a sailor today. So when DNA companies show a percentage labeled Scandinavian, they are not confirming Viking ancestry. They are only showing that a person has genetic roots from that geographic region. Norway, Sweden, Denmark, Iceland. That region has always had a mix of different peoples moving in and out for thousands of years, long before and after the so-called Viking Age. This means having Scandinavian DNA does not automatically mean your ancestors swung a sword on a longship. Your ancestor could have simply been a farmer, a fisherman, a quiet villager who lived a peaceful life far from any battle. For many people, this discovery hit hard. The warrior image they held onto for years suddenly felt shaky. But the story does not stop there. It goes even deeper. If you're starting to feel like everything you thought about ancestry might be more complicated than you imagined, you are not alone. Keep watching, because the next part of this story reveals something even scientists did not expect. Researchers studying ancient Viking burial sites made a discovery that shocked historians. They examined skeletons buried with Viking weapons, armor, and ships, expecting to confirm pure Scandinavian bloodlines. Instead, they found something surprising. Genetic diversity. Some of the individuals buried as Vikings with full Viking honors actually carried DNA from places far outside Scandinavia. Some had ancestry linked to areas near the British Isles. Others showed traces connected to southern Europe and even further regions through trade and migration routes. This means the so-called Viking world was not a closed, pure bloodline of tall, blonde warriors. It was actually a mixing pot. Vikings traveled far. They traded goods. They formed alliances. They intermarried with people from other lands. Over centuries, this created a blend of ancestries within what people call the Viking identity. In simple words, being a Viking was never about one specific bloodline. It was about culture, travel, and shared way of life across the sea. This discovery changes everything for the modern story. If ancient Vikings themselves were already a mix of many backgrounds, then the idea of a pure Viking bloodline reaching into modern American families becomes even more complicated. So why do so many Americans still believe strongly in this identity? Here is where emotion enters the story, because this is not just about genetics. It is about human need, human belonging. For immigrant families who arrived in America searching for a new beginning, the Viking image gave them something powerful: pride, strength, a shared story to hold on to in a new and unfamiliar land. When you leave everything behind and start over, having a strong identity helps you survive. It gives your children something proud to say when someone asks where they come from. The Viking legend was bold, fearless, adventurous. It matched the courage it took to cross an ocean and build a new life in America. So even if the DNA connection was never fully accurate, the emotional connection felt completely real. And in many ways, it still does. This is where the story becomes deeply human. Because identity is never only about facts. It is about meaning. It is about the stories we choose to carry forward. But now here comes another twist that most people never expected. If you think you already know how this story ends, wait until you hear what real historians and geneticists say happened to the actual Vikings after their so-called age ended. This next part might surprise you more than anything so far. The Viking Age is generally believed by historians to have started around the late 700s and ended around the mid-1000s. During this time, Norse seafarers raided, traded, and settled in many parts of Europe, including parts of England, Ireland, France, and even reaching as far as North America long before Columbus. But after this period, something interesting happened. The Vikings, as a distinct raiding force, slowly disappeared. Not because they vanished into thin air, but because they blended, they settled. They became farmers, traders, and townspeople. Their descendants slowly merged into the growing nations of Europe. Norway became Norway, Sweden became Sweden, Denmark became Denmark. The warrior identity faded into ordinary daily life. This means that most Scandinavians living today, whether in Europe or descended in America, are not walking proof of pure Viking warrior bloodlines. They are simply descendants of the general population of that region, some of whom were Vikings and many of whom were not. So when an American DNA test shows Scandinavian ancestry, it usually means your family history connects to that region broadly, not specifically to Viking raiders. This is where many people feel a small sting of disappointment. The warrior dream softens into something more ordinary. But is ordinary really less meaningful? Let us pause here for a moment and think deeper. If your ancestors were not warriors, but instead were farmers, fishermen, or simple villagers who worked the land every single day just to survive brutal winters, does that make your bloodline weaker? Or does it make it even more powerful? Because surviving centuries of hard winters, hunger, disease, and hardship takes a different kind of strength. A quiet strength, a patient strength, the kind that does not show up in movies, but the kind that actually built entire nations. This is where the story shifts from myth to something even more meaningful: real human resilience. Now here is something that adds even more mystery to this story. Scientists studying DNA patterns across America discovered something unexpected. Many people who strongly believe they have Viking or Scandinavian roots actually show very small percentages of that ancestry, sometimes less than 5%. Meanwhile, some people who never even considered Viking heritage show surprisingly higher percentages without ever knowing it. This proves something powerful. Ancestry is often invisible until science reveals it. It hides quietly inside our bodies, waiting. This means somewhere across America right now, someone who has never once thought about Vikings might actually carry more Norse ancestry than someone proudly wearing a Viking-themed shirt at a football game. Is not that a strange twist of fate? If this story is making you rethink what you thought you knew about your own roots, imagine sharing it with someone in your life. This might completely change how they see their story too. Now let us go even deeper into why this Viking myth grew so strong in American culture specifically. During the 1800s and early 1900s, as waves of Scandinavian immigrants arrived in the United States, communities needed a strong identity to hold on to in a new country. Popular books, poems, and later movies romanticized Vikings as fearless heroes. Hollywood especially played a huge role, showing tall, muscular blonde warriors charging into battle with horned helmets. Interestingly, historians point out that the horned helmet image itself is mostly fictional. Actual archaeological evidence from Viking Age burial sites rarely shows horned helmets. Most Viking helmets were simple, practical, and built for real combat, not dramatic decoration. The horned helmet image mostly came from 19th century opera costumes and later Hollywood films, not real history. This means one of the most iconic symbols people associate with Vikings was partly invented much later, blending myth with imagination. This detail adds even more depth to our mystery. If even the visual image of Vikings was partly created by artists rather than pure history, how much of what we believe about Viking identity today is shaped more by stories than by fact? And yet, myths are powerful. They shape culture. They shape pride. They shape how millions of people see themselves, even generations later. So where does this leave the 40 million Americans who believe they carry Viking blood? The truth is layered, and layered truth is often more interesting than simple truth. Some of these people likely do have genetic roots connecting back to Scandinavian regions based on DNA evidence. Immigration history supports large movements of Scandinavian families into America, especially into states like Minnesota, Wisconsin, and North Dakota. So a real geographic and ancestral connection exists for many of them, but strictly speaking, having Scandinavian DNA is not the same as confirming direct descent from Viking raiders specifically. The two ideas often get blended together in popular culture and casual conversation, even though scientifically they are different things. This is not about calling people wrong for feeling proud. It is about understanding the difference between cultural identity and confirmed ancestral proof. Both are meaningful in their own way, just in different forms. Cultural identity connects people through shared history, traditions, food, language, and community memory passed through generations. Scientific ancestry connects people through measurable genetic markers traced through DNA. Sometimes they align closely, sometimes they diverge. And that gap right there is where this entire mystery lives. Now, here is something that brings this story full circle in a powerful way. Genetic researchers studying the Viking Age eventually confirmed something remarkable. Even though pure Viking bloodlines cannot be scientifically isolated the way popular imagination hopes, the historical impact of the Viking Age is still very real. Norse explorers truly did reach North America centuries before Columbus, landing in areas like modern-day Newfoundland and Canada. Evidence found at archaeological sites supports early Norse presence in North America long before widespread European colonization. This means the spirit of exploration Americans admire in Viking legends is not entirely myth. Real Norse explorers really did cross dangerous seas, face brutal unknown lands, and push into new territory with incredible courage. That part of the story remains true, even if the specific bloodline connection to modern families is more complicated than a simple DNA percentage. So maybe the deeper truth is not about proving a bloodline. Maybe it is about honoring a spirit of courage, of moving into the unknown, of surviving impossible conditions, of starting over in a new land, again and again across centuries. Is not that exactly what immigrant families did when they left Scandinavia and crossed the ocean into America? Is not that the same brave spirit repeating itself through history, generation after generation? Maybe that is the true inheritance. Not a bloodline soaked in battle glory, but a pattern of courage passed down through choices, not just chromosomes. Before we move into the final part of this story, ask yourself something honestly. If science one day told you your ancestors were not warriors, not kings, not legends, but simply hardworking, quiet, resilient people who never gave up, would that change how proud you feel of where you came from? Take a moment and really sit with that question, because the answer might reveal something important about how you see your own identity. Now let S bring this entire story together. The idea that 40 million Americans carry Viking blood is not a simple yes or no answer. It is a blend of real history, real DNA science, cultural pride, immigrant memory, and centuries of storytelling shaped by movies, books, and imagination. DNA testing has shown that most people carrying Scandinavian ancestry are not necessarily descendants of Viking raiders specifically, but rather descendants of the wider population living in that region across many centuries. The Viking identity itself was never a single bloodline. It was a role, a lifestyle, a moment in history shaped by exploration and trade, carried by people from many mixed backgrounds. Archaeological discoveries revealed that even ancient Vikings themselves were more genetically diverse than long assumed, connected to distant regions through travel, trade, and intermarriage. This breaks the myth of a pure, isolated warrior bloodline even at its historical root. And yet, despite all this scientific nuance, the emotional truth remains powerful. Millions of families found strength, pride, and identity through the Viking story, especially as they built new lives in America. That emotional truth matters, even when it does not perfectly match a DNA percentage on a screen. Maybe the real lesson hidden inside this mystery is this: identity is not only written in DNA. It is also written in memory, in courage, in the choices our ancestors made to survive, to move forward, and to build something new despite fear. Whether your ancestors were sailing warriors, quiet farmers, fishermen, traders, or simply ordinary people trying to survive harsh winters, their strength lives inside you in ways science cannot always measure with a simple percentage. So the next time you hear someone proudly say, "I have Viking blood," maybe the more powerful truth is this: you come from people who survived, people who adapted, people who crossed oceans, both literally and emotionally, searching for something better. And that story, whether written in DNA or written in memory, deserves to be honored either way. Because in the end, this is not just a story about Vikings. It is a story about what it truly means to belong to something bigger than yourself, and about how far people are willing to search across oceans, across centuries, and even across their own blood, just to understand where they truly come from.